Some say you should never touch it. Some say it's all you should use, claiming that if anything more were needed, it means you're going just too gosh darn fast. So what's the real answer? Today, we explore the rear brake. Hi, my name is Dave, and I've been a professional motorcycle coach for 25 years, starting with teaching state, basic, and experienced rider courses for over a decade. I'm currently a champion certified coach with Yamaha Champ School, and I'm certified with the USMCA, among other things. So let's get into this. When we look at crash data, one of the primary places where we're dying is when vehicles invade our right-of-way in an intersection, most often an unmarked intersection like driveways or parking lot entrances or whatever else. And what we're seeing is an overwhelming majority of them, there's a big long skid from the rear tire, but the rider never even touched the front brake. So there's a good chance that you or someone that you ride with may be relying too heavily on the rear brake and not nearly enough on the front. So the first point I want to make before we really dive into this is that first and foremost, the rear brake exists to complement the front brake. Even so much that when I'm working with a student who is trying to figure this out, is to think of it like the front brake is for slowing down and getting the motorcycle to change direction, and the rear brake is for precision. So let me say that again, as ironic as it may sound. The rear brake is a very precise tool designed to complement the front. And that's why you may be a rider who's never used the rear brake, and why you may have heard of other riders who say they've never even used the rear brake. But here's the cool thing. If we go look at our scientific evidence, our laboratory, which is racing, there's been a dramatic change in how much we actually understand about the rear brake. You see, right now in MotoGP, the Michelin front tire is terrible and it's having a lot of problems. However, the rear tire is insanely capable. And one of the reasons why Ducati is just dominating the entire series right now is because they built their entire bike around that rear tire and have found a way to exploit that grip, especially when it comes to braking. Sylvain Guintoli said it's almost impossible to ride a modern MotoGP bike without using a ton of rear brake. Whereas he said he never even touched the rear brake the entire season he won the World Superbike Championship. All right then, so what exactly does the rear brake do? Well, it's a brake, right? It slows you down. But motorcycles are surprisingly complicated things. And if we look at the placement of the rear brake, it's attached directly to the swing arm. So when we apply the rear brake and it pulls against that disc, it's pulling the back of the bike down into the ground. So using this toy, if we think about where the energy goes with the front brake, the bike kind of wants to rotate around the front wheel, the stoppie, right? All right, well then what's happening at the rear when we use the rear brake? The bike wants to rotate around the rear wheel and it pulls the whole bike down. It causes the bike to settle or to squat. It's really easy to see this in reverse too, like this clip from Champ U. If we release the brake quickly, the back of the bike will just spring up. But if we release the rear brake slowly, it controls that rebound. So then the rear brake on a heavy touring bike or a long, low cruiser, it's going to inherently be more effective because there's automatically more weight over that rear wheel. While the rear brake on a sport bike may only provide maybe 5% of braking force. And then we have dirt bikes or supermoto bikes or flat trackers. They're also a little bit different because they'll often use the rear brake to break traction to help the bike get spun around or to get direction out of a corner. But the point that we want to remember is that the rear brake helps put more load onto the rear tire and helps reduce the load on the front tire. It's not a lot, but when the pace comes up or when the grip goes down, things become increasingly important. Do you know what else is important? Communication. And what better way to communicate than with a Cardo headset? How was that segue? Cardo has been a longtime supporter of this channel, and part of that means you can help us and get the best deal available at the moment if you use our link and/or our coupon code. Cardo systems really are the standard for motorcycle comms, and with good reason. They're packed with features that actually mean something, like the active mesh or the nicer JBL speakers and the new crash detection. And my favorite, the Bluetooth sound recording, so you can sync it up to an action camera and record vlogs without having to mess with wires and microphones. So if you're considering getting comms or updating your old system, please consider Cardo. All right, so then how or where do we use the rear brake? Well, first, it's a brake, right? Even if it's just 5% of braking performance, if we can shorten our braking distance even by just 5% in a bad situation, that can really make a difference, and that's relevant. The other place where it's super useful is two-up riding. You have somebody on the back and you want them to have a good experience. So some rear brake before going to the front brake makes it so the passenger doesn't feel like they're getting thrown up and forward. One of my favorite places is entering corners on a downhill road, right? We have even more weight or pressure over that front tire because we're going downhill, and we can reduce that pressure on the front tire with some rear brake pressure. And then this one's a little bit more advanced, but can we trail brake with the rear brake? Oh yeah, for sure. When we apply some rear brake pressure mid-corner, it'll reduce our radius. And the best way I know how to describe this is it'll just like suck the bike up towards the apex. And then finally, it's an amazing gauge for how much grip we have. Like, so starting a ride in the morning or whatever, and you're still going pretty slow, slowly build pressure with that rear brake. And if it locks immediately, you'll know that you don't have a lot of grip and you can adjust your riding accordingly. Now, here's the problem with the rear brake. On most bikes, it's still just too powerful, especially most Japanese bikes. So we have to learn how to use it. The first and last 5% of how we apply the rear brake is even more important because it's so much easier to put too much pressure into that lever. In fact, a lot of racers will do things to reduce the mechanical advantage of the rear brake. They'll shorten the lever, they'll drill holes in the rear rotor, or even cut out brake pad material. But especially on sporty bikes, we need to have a soft touch with that rear brake. You know, we talk about going to the brake earlier, lighter, and longer, but with the rear brake, it's earlier than you think, and it's lighter than you think, and possibly a lot longer than you think, because it is so easy to overmodulate and lock the rear brake. So if you're gonna start using the rear brake and implementing it into your riding, learn how to use it, practice with it. So on the track, I take advantage of the rear brake in a few places, like the end of a long, fast straightaway where I'm braking heavy into a corner and I want to reduce some of that pressure on the front tire, and I want that extra 5% of slowing power. Going to the rear brake just before the front brake really settles the whole bike down. Instead of going into the corner heavy on the nose, the back of the bike really light, with a little bit of rear brake pressure, I'm talking maybe 5-7% brake pressure, the whole bike will just settle into the corner. Occasionally, I'll use it when I'm really fast in the middle of the corner and I'm not confident I'm gonna get to my apex, but I also don't wanna put more pressure into the front brake. I'll use some light rear brake pressure. That big fat rear tire, it has the points in it. I can put load into it and it'll actually help reduce some of that pressure on the front tire and suck me up closer to that apex. Two things to keep in mind. The first is we're talking a light touch. Like only a few points of pressure are really all that's ever required on the rear brake. The other thing is this is a lot easier to do when turning left and a lot harder to do in right-hand turns. And that's why most pros have started using either a scooter or a thumb brake on the left hand, so they can still use the rear brake no matter which side they're leaned over, or a lot of times they're using the rear brake in conjunction with the leg dangle. But here's the thing, especially on the track, we really need to remember that the rear brake is there to complement the front. It's fine tuning. It's a much lower priority. My advice for track riders is to play with it. Know that it's there, but if it starts to distract you and you're making mistakes, don't worry about it so much. There's other things that are more important. But let's get back to the street. And there's two important points I want to make. The first is for riders who may not be using the rear brake in their riding at all. There are a lot more scenarios on the street where we get a lot of value from some light rear brake pressure. Riding with the passenger, right? We talked about that. Then there's bigger, heavier bikes. They inherently have more weight over the rear tire. The rear brake is going to be more effective. I find it's a great way to manage my speed and help modulate my grip when I don't know what my grip level is. I can go to the brakes and start loading the tires a lot earlier without having to give up too much speed. On the long travel suspension multistrada, it helps me manage how much the forks dive because the rear brake kind of pulls the whole bike down together. And let's not forget about those situations where you find yourself in a dirt parking lot. It's nice to have a working rear brake that we're comfortable using. That's point one. Point two may or may not apply to you, but it has to be said. If you're a rider who relies mostly on your rear brake and rarely uses your front brake, remember, the rear brake exists to complement the front brake, even on your cruiser, even on your big heavy tour bike, even if you prefer riding at a mellower pace. The front brake is still the one we need to rely on the most. Don't let the rear brake overshadow the importance of the front brake. All right, so then with all of that said, when do we use the rear brake? That's right, it depends. The key to the rear brake is understanding what it can do for you, where it offers the most value, and then using it at the appropriate times. So it really is a good idea to spend some time with the rear brake and playing with it. Get familiar with it, how much pressure it takes, how little pressure is actually needed. I want to thank Yamaha Champ School. If you haven't done it yet, now's a great time to go through one of the online Champ U courses appropriate for where you are in your riding career. Coupon code FOCUS. And if you find that using the brakes before corners is just slowing you down way too much, I think you really might like this video. If you've learned something or you enjoyed this video, please click like and subscribe. It really does help. Or if you have a question that you'd like to see me answer in an upcoming video, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Ride on and ride well.